People perceive Victorian era as one of the public acting prim, proper and buttoned up, but Alice Keppel proves that what went on behind closed doors was very different. Keppel was one of the most scandalous women of her day, with scandal and antics taking place behind tightly closed bedroom doors. I will be taking a closer look at the life of Alice Keppel. On April 29, 1868, Alice Keppel was born into privilege with a silver spoon pretty much in her mouth from birth. Please continue to support my channel by subscribing. She was born to parents Sir William Edmonstone and his wife Mary Elizabeth Parsons. The couple were renowned members of the English nobility and direct descendants of the royal house of Stuart. Alice's full birth name was Alice Frederica Edmonstone, but her parents gave her the boy nickname of Freddie, due to being more like her brother than her 7 older sisters. Not only did she act like a tomboy, but she also showed a great interest in them too. It was when she became a woman in her own right that she shredded the tomboy identity she had grown accustomed to during childhood. She was the epitome of beauty in the eyes of the Victorians. She had wide blue eyes, a tiny waist, and most infamously, a plump chest. Keppel gave up the nickname Freddie for Flirtatious Freddie when she began to show off the assets she was born with. But she started to get a reputation for being a bit of a hussy. Although she was the epitome of pretty, her secret advantage was her amazing intellect too. She was highly communicative with people and she could get them chatting for hours. She could be eminently discreet, and that skill set was about to serve her very well. Alice did what was expected of her as a young, blossoming woman, and in the summer of 1891, the 23-year-old Alice got married. Her choice of groom was the well-respected and handsome Lieutenant Colonel George Keppel. He was a soldier whose family had a deep history of serving the royal family. But despite being handsome and well-respected, he couldn't fulfill all of her needs. She had very expensive taste, and the income from the military just did not cover it. In order to bring in some extra cash into the household, she could have gotten a job, but instead she took a controversial approach to her financial worries. She began to attract wealthy men and started extramarital affairs, essentially using her renowned beauty and discretion to become a Victorian mistress, and she was extremely good at it. Her first lover was Ernest Becket, the 2nd Baron of Grimthorpe, and he was much older than Keppel. He was known around the town as a philanderer, and with more money than he knew what to do with. It wasn't long after she started up this affair that she found out that she was pregnant. This put her in a difficult position in 1894. There were no DNA tests available back in the day, so she had absolutely no idea who the father of her child was. When Alice gave birth to a little girl named Violet that summer, and even her own family members were concerned that Grimthorpe was the dad. You would expect this would cause outrage for her husband, but surprisingly, they had an open marriage. This was not unusual for the times. Despite the people being publicly prudish, behind closed doors, many of the high-class families had mistresses and affairs. Her and her husband struggled financially, but after she started serving wealthy men, the financial burden was lessened, as though he was 100% supportive of her. He even engaged in some of his own affairs and once noted, "I do not mind what she does as long as she comes back to me in the end." Although he was okay with her affairs, some things even made him question things when a prince fell in love with her. 4 years later, the now 29-year-old socialite was living in the wealthy area of Mayfair in London when she was working as a hostess. This was where she would meet her prince, the future King Edward VII, the eldest son of Queen Victoria and the heir to the British throne. I'd say it was the start of a beautiful friendship, but it was more like an outrageous romance. Her new lover was controversial. The public and his family had a love-hate relationship with the man due to his womanizing ways and endless scandals. He was married to Alexandra of Denmark, but there had not been one time throughout the couple's history that he had stuck to his matrimonial vows. He was always frequented with women of the night in Paris, as well as up to 55 mistresses throughout their marriage. He had a particular thing for other married women in the form of beautiful actresses and noblewomen throughout England. Not only did Edward have a thing for married women, she also had a thing for controversial, bad men. The man lived a life of overindulgence in all parts of his life. He put on the pounds with all the food he ate. He gambled excessively, as well as womanized an unruly number of women. When the royal was 56, he met Alice, and he was old enough to be her father. Edward even famously commissioned a love chair that would let him romance a woman without crushing her with his considerable girth. Yep, this is what Alice was getting herself into, although maybe it was Edward who should have watched out. Soon after her first meetings with Prince Edward, Alice Keppel discovered that she was pregnant again, and she went on to have a little girl called Sonia in 1900. A lot of people rumoured that Sonia was Edward's illegitimate daughter, but despite these rumours, Sonia was actually her husband George Keppel's child. Prince Edward enjoyed a rendezvous with married women, perhaps for the secret sneakiness of it. He was probably surprised by the tolerance of Keppel's husband, who even accommodated his affair. The Prince of Wales was a frequent visitor to the Keppel home in Mayfair, and each time he appeared, George made sure to be on his way out. Although this was convenient for the romancing couple, it was also somewhat awkward. The Prince of Wales was used to getting his own way in all aspects of his life, and he would throw tantrums if he did not get what he wanted in the first instance. However, Keppel was able to calm down the king's mood swings with her communicative gift. She was one of the very few people in Edward's life who could reliably talk him down. As one witness commented, Edward was a much pleasanter child since he changed mistresses. The relationship was not one way. She gave a lot to Edward, but she also got a lot back in the form of financial security for her and her family. Maybe this was why her husband was so understanding of her arrangement with Edward. Keppel was working overtime as a royal mistress to keep Edward sweet, and he repaid her with the royal endowments. She was even able to secure her husband and her brother great jobs for royal connections. Keppel was popular with more than just Edward. Even his wife was keener on him than his previous mistresses. Alexandra of Denmark was used to dealing with his previous side piece, Daisy Greville, who was brash and loud about her bedroom association with royalty. Keppel, by contrast, knew just what to do to get Alexandra on her side by staying inconspicuous and not flaunting her affair in front of everybody. This showed great respect for Edward and his wife, and she kept their royal relationship on the down low as much as possible. Alexandra couldn't help but like her, and the Princess of Wales became at the very least an uneasy ally to Keppel. Alice had a way with men, but her ability to butter up women was understated too. She was liked by Alexandra and even helped Edward choose gifts for his wife. And she was dang good at it too, once helping create a set of Fabergé animals, since Alexandra collected them. In 1901, Alice's life was upgraded to the next stage again when her man became the King of England after the death of his mother, Queen Victoria. The new Edwardian era had begun, and Keppel was right in the middle of the period, alongside Edward, the new monarch. She was able to gain great power as an advisor for Edward, and she would often be the go-between for her lover and his ministers. Many of the king's deals were done in Alice's own drawing room, and she hosted a number of dinners to tactfully get an arguable topic dropped into conversation to gauge effect, which was reported back to the king. She was able to do this inconspicuously, as she avoided the topic of her political influence. Instead, she would rather it stayed quiet between those concerned. When the Prime Minister's wife, Margot Asquith, once talked about Keppel as the king's advisor, the royal mistress was furious. Before long, however, she had bigger things to worry about. Keppel was one of the most persuasive women in all of England, and she could persuade the king to do many things. But despite her attempts, she was never able to rid the king of his addictions, such as eating and smoking, and his appetite only grew bigger as he grew older, and towards the end of his life he was enjoying 12 meals a day, alongside 20 cigarettes. Edward believed that he was immortal, but of course he was very wrong. Keppel was quite gifted in foreseeing future events, and she tried to stop the fatal events from unfolding when the king fell ill. She even reached out to a renowned minister and requested that he help her lover. She wrote to him, "I want you to try and get the king to see a proper doctor about his knee. Do what you can with your famous tact, and of course, don't tell anyone I wrote to you." But tragically, this never happened. It wasn't long until the king started to deteriorate further. He was suffering from bronchitis, perhaps due to his cigar habit, but he was also unfortunate enough to suffer from a rodent ulcer on his nose, which is a type of skin cancer. He was given radium to cure the cancer away, which was the treatment back then, but he still wasn't exactly in the best shape, and then disaster struck. Edward was not faring too well, and by 1909 his ailments were taking their toll on him. In February of that year, he lost consciousness during a state visit, and then in March 1910, during another diplomatic trip to France, the king completely collapsed, requiring a prolonged stay in the foreign country to recuperate before returning home to Keppel. Keppel was well respected by the firm, and she had a great influence over the king too. This is why many historians consider her one of the last true royal mistresses, if not the last due to her ability to influence the official politics at the time. Not only was she intelligent, but during her youthful years, she was also an English rose, the epitome of the ideal woman of the times. One writer said of the famed mistress and society hostess, "She could have impersonated Britannia in a tableau vivant and done that lady credit." She was a very busy lady. She had many roles as a wife to her husband, a mother to her children, and now the mistress of the king. She managed to keep them all happy, as her daughter expressed, because it was just in her nature. Violet noted that her mother not only had a gift of happiness, but she excelled in making others happy. She resembled a Christmas tree laden with presents for everybody. When her king returned to her in the spring of 1910, her life was about to change forever. They were never able to properly reunite ever again, as the king suffered a number of consecutive heart attacks in a row on the 6th of May 1910. The king did not give up. He refused to admit his frail state, instead adamant that he would continue and refusing to lie down. He is quoted as saying, "No, I shall not give in. I shall go on. I shall work to the end." Alice got a whiff of the king's imminent death. She was beside herself. She put her composed state aside, instead breaking down in tears, busting through the palace, and impolitely running to be at his bedside. Although Alice had gained a friend in Queen Alexandra, who graciously allowed her in, the situation was awkward, and understandably the consort was not thrilled by the public display of affection from the king's mistress while he lay on his deathbed. Edward was surrounded by the women he loved, Alice and Alexandra, and in an attempt to reduce the tension between the women, he ordered Alex to kiss Alice. This commandment did not soothe the situation and instead made it much worse. At this point, even the polite and patient Queen Alexandra couldn't take it any longer. She instead turned to Alice and demanded that she leave the room. Keppel's response has gone down in history. She had been given a direct order by the Queen, who was of a higher ranking than her. The realization that she would never see the king again dawned on her, and she became hysterical in her response. She broke down into rage sobs, screaming, "I never did any harm. There was nothing wrong between us. What is to become of me?" Sadly, it didn't end there. Keppel was so beside herself and out of her mind with grief that she couldn't even leave the king's bedside of her own free will. Instead, she had to be dragged out of the room by members of the royal household while she was still sobbing and screaming, and they pretty much threw her out onto the street. It wasn't Keppel's most dignified moment, and she knew it. She took some time after this fiasco to reflect on the events, but she just tried to pretend it had never happened in a bid to remove all embarrassment. It took a long time for her to openly admit the truth of that day, and perhaps even longer to come to terms with what happened next. Just after 11:30 in the evening on the 6th of May 1910, King Edward VII breathed his last, passing at the age of 68. The king's death wasn't just the end of the Edwardian era, it was also the end of Alice Keppel's influence in the royal court. So while the world prepared to give the monarch a state funeral, Keppel planned her final goodbye. Now the Dowager Queen Alexandra kindly allowed the king's mistress to be part of the funeral on the 17th of May. However, she made sure that the couple's relationship was kept from the public eye, as she was to enter and leave through a side door. Keppel had completely fallen out of favour with the court after the death of the king, that she no longer had any standing or influence in the court. Her scandalous position made her enormous enemies, and among them was Edward's son and heir, the new King George V, and his wife Mary of Teck. They wished for a more traditional court and wanted to rid it of his father's debauched ways. The first step to this was to ban Keppel from it altogether. With the king's cold body lying in the ground, Alice Keppel was forced to make a heartbreaking decision. She was no longer welcome in the many drawing rooms that she used to light up. Her family made the decision to leave England for a better life, and in November 1910, just a few months after Edward's passing, she still had all of the same skills that she had before, and her ability to woo people did not stop in the royal court. She went on to make famous friends while in Italy in exile. Keppel and her husband continued to host impeccable parties, and it was here that other exiled members of other royal families, including Greece, Yugoslavia, and Spain, as well as a young Winston Churchill himself. In the lead up to World War II, the Keppel family returned to England after decades away from their home country. Nothing was the same, and their lives were completely changed forever. It was now 1940, on the cusp of technology of the 20th century, and they were now old-fashioned ruins of bygone time. The monarchy had also changed beyond belief. King Edward VII's grandson, Edward VIII, was on the throne, but in 1936 he gave it all up and abdicated for his own royal mistress, Wallis Simpson. Eventually, the changed England became too much for Alice and George, and they went straight back to the ideals of their Italian villa in 1946. They had just spent 6 years in Britain and returned almost as soon as they could after the end of World War II. Her end was painful, and in early 1947, Alice Keppel's life took a dark turn. She was now an old lady at 79 years old. She wasn't in the bloom of her youth, and her health began to plummet. That September, the legendary mistress passed in her villa from cirrhosis of the liver. Against all odds, she remained married to her devoted husband of 56 years, George Keppel. They were still so in love with each other despite the arrangement earlier in their lives, and George followed Alice only 2 months later, perhaps with a broken heart. They are now buried beside each other in Florence, and Alice was infamous as a mistress to King Edward VII, but her legacy did not stop there. Her great-great-granddaughter is Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall, who is the infamous mistress turned wife of Prince Charles. Charles, who is King Edward VII's great-great-great-grandson. And when Camilla first met Charles, legend has it that Camilla quipped, "My great-great-grandmother was your great-great-grandfather's mistress, so how about it?" Please continue to support my channel by subscribing.
Please comment, like and subscribe if you wish for more stories, and leave your suggestions below and I will endeavour to cover them.